I guess, joining us today. We have Andrew, who has joined us from, where are you actually in the country?
I'm in Hartford, Connecticut. I'm in Connecticut.
From Connecticut. And we weren't able to have the Double D tour this year because of COVID and everything going on with that. But we do have it in an app form if you want to download the app. It's on IZI Travel. And then you can tour the ranch. It has oral histories and things that we wouldn't be able to offer on our normal tours. So it's actually really cool. There's historic photographs and everything as well. So as you walk around to the different buildings, it'll pop up and tell you a little bit about, well, you'll have to read it, but a little bit about each building. And then the oral histories will play as well. So you get the first person information and then kind of the whole history of the ranch. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Andrew and can go ahead and present.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you to the Matizzi Museum for having me, and everyone who's tuning in or watching this later. My name's Andrew Belonsky. I wrote a book called The Log Cabin: An Illustrated History. Hopefully you can see the cover over here on my computer. And today I'm obviously going to discuss.
You haven't started. I think you're going to have to re-screen share.
Redo it? Okay, that's good. That's fine. How's that?
That's good. We can see your Word document in the background, but
that's quite all right. There's nothing there.
Yeah.
No secrets. Anyway, as I was saying, I'm going to talk about the history of the log cabin in America, which is not a very straightforward history, actually, I learned. And it's going to be about 45 minutes. I'm going to talk about first how the log cabin came to America, how it spread across the colonies and then the states, how it became an icon, and in time, how it became a vacation destination, because I know that, a lot of my friends, myself, we like to go to cabins for a vacation, but this was something that was actually quite unthinkable for many centuries here first in the colonies and then in the United States. And there will be a question and answer after this, but I'm going to start with the answer to a question that I get a lot, which is why I wrote this book. And it's actually kind of random. I didn't intend on writing this book. I was actually originally going to write a book about the ways in which 19th century art influenced the original Green Movement in the United States, how it sort of awakened Americans' ideas to the diversity of life here. And as I was doing my research, I was looking at a lot of paintings and a lot of postcards and maps, and the log cabin kept popping up in the imagery. And this got me wondering, why is the log cabin such a big deal in America? It's really kind of everywhere in our culture. And, drawing on the knowledge I had at the time, I figured, of course, Lincoln had something to do with it because he was famously, born and raised in a log cabin. And then I also had this sort of notion that it had something to do with Jamestown and Plymouth, and that the Pilgrims and the Puritans had come over and invented the log cabin, and that was the reason why the cabin had become an American icon. And what's weird about this is I don't remember actually ever learning that. I don't remember a teacher telling me that, but it may have been influenced by images such as these. This first image you see here, it's titled Plymouth in 1622. That's Plymouth, Massachusetts. This was made in 1890 for a postcard series on early America. And as you can see, it depicts Plymouth with a number of log cabins as sort of the epicenter of the colonies. And then we have this image, which is from the 1920s. It's another postcard, and it shows a Native American and Pilgrims enjoying a Thanksgiving dinner together inside a log cabin, which, even the most basic knowledge indicate this is not real. So I got to be curious about this, and I started to do some research. I actually learned that these images here are based on a series of lies and myths that were built up over the 19th century. In fact, the English didn't have log cabins in any of their colonies because the English didn't even know the log cabin existed. While we obviously can't know for sure where the log cabin originally came from, archaeologists suspect that it first started developing in continental Europe maybe around 9,000 to 6,000 before the Common Era. And it spread through the region. It spread into Russia, it spread into the Nordic countries and Germany, but it never got to England because England was an island. I'm not quite sure why the Vikings didn't bring it over, but they didn't. So the English couldn't have brought the log cabin to America. It was actually brought here by a group that a lot of people don't even think about, and I'm not sure I even knew existed. It was the Swedes and the Finns who came over in 1638 to found New Sweden. And they settled in what's today Pennsylvania and New Jersey along the Delaware River and created a little colony there. And, you know, having been in the continent, they knew how to create log cabins. It's what came naturally. So that's what they did. And you might think that this is how the log cabin got its start, but New Sweden was a very small colony and they didn't have much cultural cachet and it didn't last very long. And what's more, the English weren't about to adopt a log cabin. Again, they didn't have any knowledge of it, but even after learning about the log cabin and seeing the Swedes and the Finns build log cabins, the English still refused to do so. And this was because, you know, they were kind of snobs. They were really used to fine frame houses from back home, and that's what they wanted to live in. So in the meantime, while they waited for mills to be built or lumber to be shipped, they would sleep in like dugouts and lean-tos and mud huts. And the colonial records from back then are actually full of reports of people getting sick and dying because they had such inferior homes, and yet the English still wouldn't live in a log cabin. They would rather suffer and live in a mud hut while they waited for wood to be built than live in a log cabin. That shows just live in. So in the meantime, while they waited for mills to be built or lumber to be shipped, they would sleep in like dugouts and lean-tos and mud huts. And the colonial records from back then are actually full of reports of people getting sick and dying because they had such inferior homes, and yet the English still wouldn't live in a log cabin. They would rather suffer and live in a mud hut while they waited for wood to be built than live in a log cabin. That shows just how deeply ingrained their, I guess, suspicion at this point of a different type of house was. So that's how the log cabin got here. The Swedish and the Finns brought it over in 1638, and for the rest of the 1600s, the log cabin was only used by them. And it wasn't until the early 18th century, the early 1700s, that the log cabin had a larger footprint here. And that was because of waves and waves of immigrants coming over. There were two sets primarily. The first people who came over were the Germans, and they were followed maybe about a decade later by the Scots-Irish. And this was just a massive migration to the colonies at this point. It was hundreds of thousands of people coming over, and a lot of them built log cabins. The Germans, they knew about log cabins from back home, so it was completely natural for them to build these cabins. And the Scots-Irish, they didn't know about the log cabins, but they were, you know, they were less tied to the frame house than the English. So they were game to try anything. So they would imitate their German neighbors and make these cabins, which, you know, letters and records of the time talk about how unattractive these cabins were and how dismal. And, you know, that was true. These cabins that we idolize now were filled with bugs, and they were muddy and they were dirty and they stank. But to the Germans and the Scots-Irish, it wasn't really about what the cabin looked like. It was about what the cabin represented. And in a word, it represented freedom, right? These people had been living overseas under religious, social, and cultural oppression, and coming to the colonies and building a log cabin is really the first step in what they hoped would be a progression from peasantry to, I guess, the regency or the upper classes at least. So the log cabin, it may have stunk, it may have been filled with bugs, but this was a really essential abode for them, and it really made freedom possible. And what's interesting to me, at least, is that when the immigrants came over, there were a lot of people, they were mixing and melding. And I'm sorry, I forgot to cue up this image. This is a 1950s era retelling of what New Sweden looked like at the time. You can see the log structures in the background. And this image is to depict the immigrants coming over. Obviously, this is not from the early 1700s, but this actually depicts kind of where I was going, which is that when the Germans and the Scots-Irish came over, they had their own architectural styles. The Germans were known to create an off-center door to create more space on one side of the cabin. The Swedes were known to have, very nice notching between the logs, which didn't require any nails, which is why this was such a perfect structure for poor immigrants, because you could just cut down a tree and make some notches and stack the logs up together. And the Scots-Irish, they weren't very familiar with how to build log cabins, so their cabins looked often like this one. You'll note that it has the chimneys kind of tacked on to the side, because the Scots-Irish didn't know how to build the cabin around the chimney. And this probably looks familiar because it really caught on with a lot of other groups. And that was, that's a very poetic thing about the log cabin in the early 1700s, is that it was a vehicle for freedom. It originally was distinguished by ethnic architectural preferences, but over time it became a melting pot. These groups were all sort of, just meeting one another, and they're trading ideas, and they're helping each other build their homes and get settled in this new world. And so the log cabin became an architectural melting pot that really came to represent one of the things that would make this country so amazing, is the interblending of cultures and the improving of cultures together. So that's really how the cabin spread through the Carolinas, the eastern seaboard, up through Maine, into the western frontiers. These poor immigrants helping one another and building cabins, and the cabins weren't just homes. They were built to be churches and schools and libraries and offices and town halls. If you needed a cheap building fast, you built a log cabin. So it was a very practical, at this point, fairly ubiquitous building, but it was still looked down upon by the English powers that be. And it's probably because it was so ubiquitous and it was so common. It was seen as the home of a poor immigrant. And, much like today, there was a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment around the colonies. And a quote from 1729 that I think is telling is from a colonial officer named James Logan. And he was writing after about 6,000 Scots-Irish people had come over to the colonies. And he wrote back to someone overseas in England. He wrote, "It looks as if Ireland is to send all of its inhabitants hither. The common fear is that if they thus continue to come, they will make themselves proprietors of the province. It is strange that they thus crowd where they are not wanted." So basically he's saying, why are all these Scots-Irish people here? We don't want them. We're very afraid. And that was a big reason why the English didn't adopt the log cabin. But, the log cabin continued to persist. It was found almost everywhere that white settlers went. And to indicate that, here is a mid-1700s image of Bethabara, Maryland, I believe, and you can see the log structures. It was a German settlement, so they relied almost entirely on log cabins, but still the general sentiment among the colonial powers that be, and even I'm sure a lot of the people who had become founding fathers, is that the people who lived in log cabins were unworthy, and the cabin was basically seen as, a trailer of the time. And, this image this is from early 20th century, but this is kind of how the people of the time viewed cabin dwellers. This man doesn't look like the kind of person that the colonial officers would respect or try to elevate in any way. And I think that one thing that's also very important to note is that the cabin at this time was also, temporary to the people who lived in it. It was just the first step. Most people didn't want to stay in cabins. If they could, they would save their money and move into a frame house, which was more respectable in English. And if they couldn't do that, they would cover their cabins with clapboard to make it look more respectable, because the cabin at that time was still something to be ashamed of. The general culture didn't respect it. And these next two images, these are early images. This one's undated, but it's from the early 1800s, and it shows, it's a very realistic and dismal view of the cabin. There's no romanticism here. There's no idolization. And similarly here, this was done by a traveler and writer named Basil Hall in 1818. This is in Georgia. And so 1818, that's after the revolution. That's after the United States has formed. And this was still pretty generally the view of law. Even the founding fathers would describe the cabins as, ragged. The people inside were ignorant. They were rubbish. They were not on par with the image of America that the founders and a lot of the East Coast elite wanted to project. And it wasn't until the 1820s or so that the cabin started to get some respect. And this is for a few interrelated reasons. Generally, the entire culture of the United States was coalescing and forming. This was due to geographic expansion. The western frontier of Ohio and Tennessee and Kentucky was being more rapidly settled. We purchased Louisiana. The first inklings of manifest destiny were starting to arise, especially after Lewis and Clark sent back their reports from their expedition. Americans started to have this greater conception of how much land there was for us to conquer and the role that the log cabin would play therein. So it started to become more of a utilitarian structure. And meanwhile, as this was happening, after independence, the states, we said that we were united, but there were still a lot of regional differences. I mean, much like today, but even more so. We didn't have an economy. The states were largely distrustful of one another. We didn't have any sort of national cohesion, to be honest. And that didn't really start to develop until after the War of 1812. I'm not sure if you recall, but this was our second war against the English Empire, and it was our second victory, which was pretty incredible because we were a new nation, we were very poor, and we had gone up against this mighty empire and we had defeated them, and that was incredible. And it really it went far in building patriotism. Of course, the Battle of Fort McHenry, I think it was, inspired the Star-Spangled Banner, which is great evidence of how patriotic Americans were starting to feel. And a really great quote, this was from Treasury Secretary Albert Gallatin at the time. He wrote, "The war has renewed and reinstated the national feelings and character which the revolution had given and which were daily lessened. The people are more American. They feel and act more as a nation." So we're starting to come together. We saw the geographic expansion. We were finally proud of ourselves. And this fed into the development of a distinct American culture. After the revolution, we still were reading English books. We were still very much influenced by English norms and culture. We used them as a litmus test. And it wasn't until the 1810s and 1820s that American writers and artists started to portray life in America. And since the log cabin was almost everywhere that white people went in America, it started to make appearances in this art. It would make like little cameos in poems or in the background of paintings. But there were two very instrumental works that helped cement the log cabin's place in this art scene. And the first one was a book called The Pioneers by James Fenimore Cooper. And if you're familiar with American literature, this was the first installment in what would become known as the Leather Stocking series, which included, of course, The Last of the Mohicans. The Pioneers, however, was the first one in this series. It was written in 1824, and the cabin is only mentioned briefly in it, but the book itself had a tremendous impact on changing the way people thought about people who lived in cabins. Previously people who lived in cabins were, they were seen as poor, they were seen as ignorant. This quote from 1787 really captures it. Dr. Benjamin Rush, who signed the Declaration of Independence, wrote that people who lived in cabins were generally men who had outlived their credit or fortune in cultivated parts. Dr. Rush went on to say that these people were licentious and they fled further into the woods whenever religion came calling, right? So this is, an extremely insulting thing to say, but James Fenimore Cooper's book was so popular, and it made so clear how important pioneers were to the future of the nation that it really helped change people's minds. It helped the people who lived in cabins have a renewed sense of self-respect, and it had the people on the East Coast who looked down on cabin dwellers. It further enhanced their view that the cabin was an essential part of American expansion. But, of course, we know that a picture is worth 1,000 words. In 1826, we got this one. This is by Thomas Cole. It's called Daniel Boone Sitting by the Door of His Cabin. It was inspired by Cooper's work, actually, and it is the first romanticized view of the cabin. As you see here, there's Daniel Boone and his dog. They have a heavenly light coming down upon them. Over to the left is the log cabin. It's not completely romanticized, but it's certainly better looking than some of the imagery that we had seen previously. And this image and Cooper's novel were extremely popular, and they really went a long way in gaining some respect for the pioneers. And one telling quote from 1832, it's by a man named Dr. Daniel Drake. He was a doctor in Ohio who worked on the frontier helping settlement families, stay healthy. And he wrote of the cabin, when an individual from the depths of a compressing population builds his cabin in the West, he is speedily released from the requisitions of the society he left behind. So in other words, he's saying that the cabin was creating a new type of a man, of a person, specifically a man. It was making a pioneer. It was making authentically American people. So slowly but surely, the cabin is starting to be seen as a transformative tool. But again, the emphasis is on slowly, because culture back then moved much more slowly than it does today. And for many more years, the cabin was still denigrated and thought of as temporary. But that changed in 1840. That was a presidential election. Again, you might recall this was known as the log cabin election. It was a race between Martin Van Buren and William Henry Harrison. Van Buren was, of course, the president. He was the incumbent. Harrison, on the other hand, was a not very well-known politician. He had retired from politics in 1828, which was 12 years prior. He was not well-known. He wasn't even very popular among the Whigs. They simply nominated him because, and here's a quote from the time, General Harrison was nominated because he was the most unobjectionable and therefore the most suitable candidate, right? So his party didn't have any other candidates. They thought they'd run him. That's not really a good way to start presidential campaign. But then Harrison's opponents did something that, in retrospect, was very stupid. They wrote an op-ed that had this line. It said, "Give Harrison a barrel of hard cider and a pension of $2,000 a year, and he will sit the remainder of his days in a log cabin." This doesn't sound like much considering all the vitriol we hear from politicians today, but this was, a very insulting thing to say back then. It was basically, they were trying to poor shame him. They were trying to attack Harrison as the stereotypical alcoholic, greedy, dumb log cabin dweller. And it was just really a bad choice because, as you can see from this map, a lot had changed from 1790, which is up here on the upper left, to 1820 on the lower right. The nation had expanded greatly, and a lot of these people were living in log cabins, and they were not happy to be used as an insult. This was sort of the deplorables moment of the 1840 election. And Harrison and his allies realized they could lean into this and use it to their advantage. And that's what they did. So, even though Harrison was really rich and he lived in a mansion and he never drank hard cider or any other sort of alcohol, his party started saying, yeah, he lives in a log cabin. He loves hard cider. He knows the struggle. He's just like you. You should vote for him, right? And to illustrate, the difference of what he looked like, this is what Harrison looked like in real life before the 1840 election. But when they started weaving this lie about him living in a log cabin, this is the image that was put forward. Him standing in front of a log cabin, talking to soldiers. He has a barrel of hard cider. He's very much, an average American. And, by the way, for those who don't know, hard cider was just, alcoholic cider made at home. Almost everyone had some or got some from a neighbor. So this was a very smart thing for Harrison and his party to do. And luckily for them, the newspaper industry had changed tremendously. They could now make very cheap penny presses almost anywhere in the nation and spread their message. So that's what they did. They started a lot of newspapers. Almost every single one had the log cabin in its name. There was the Log Cabin Advocate, the Log Cabin Herald, the Log Cabin Patriot, the Log Cabin Hero. Here's one simply called the Log Cabin. This one was based out of New York. They also had log cabin raisings and log cabin parades. You'll see here in the imagery, a log cabin being erected in the middle of a town. They had log cabin songs, and then manufacturers, they started making log cabin, everything. Here you see a tea set, but they also made hairbrushes and mirrors and toys. The log cabin was really everywhere. It was inescapable. It had become this symbol of American honesty and integrity. And, just to capture that, here's a quote about the Harrison's nominating convention from that year. A reporter wrote, "There's something about this which has got into the very heart of the farmers and the working class of this land. The days of the revolution have returned." So this was a tipping point for the log cabin, right? And Harrison went along. Here's another image of him that was circulated. He wrote, he told reporters at the time, "I would have preferred to remain with my family in the peace and quiet of our log cabin rather than become engaged in political or other disputes." So in this way, from this lie, the log cabin became a symbol of integrity. It became a very powerful political tool. Every presidential candidate over the next many decades tried to tie themselves to the log cabin. I think that my favorite, however, might be in 1888, William Henry Harrison's grandson went around the country in this log cabin on wheels to tie himself to his grandfather, and it worked, and he won the presidency. And as for poor William Henry Harrison, he never got to see the fruits of his labors and his lies. He died of pneumonia 31 days after his rainy inauguration because he refused to wear a jacket against his doctor's orders. So, that didn't work out very well for him. It did work out well for the log cabin, though, because suddenly it was inescapable. It was in all sorts of art and letters. I'm going to just go through 3 images that are indicative of that shift. Here is another Cole image. It's called The Hunter's Return. It's from 1845. Obviously, you can see the log cabin is, again, bathed in heavenly light. It's idealized. A similar technique is used here in an 1855 image by Asher Durand that's called First Harvest in the Wilderness. And this one's a little later. It's from 1858. It's Jasper Francis Cropsey's Eagle Cliff, Franconia Notch, New Hampshire, right? So these are just 3 of many images that were being used to celebrate the log cabin and the people within. And it was also around this time, after the 1840 election, that the log cabin started to be projected into the past. This was when we started to see those Thanksgiving lies that I mentioned earlier. Americans had become so accustomed to the log cabin being part of everyday life that, some either assumed or lied purposefully, but a lot of historians started to write that the log cabin was present in Jamestown. The log cabin was there in Plymouth. It was the home of the earliest Americans. And one quote, this was from the 250th anniversary of Jamestown in 1857. The Virginia governor at the time said, "This place," referring to Jamestown, "this place is sacred. Here the white man first met the red. Here the white man first wielded the axe to cut the first tree for the first log cabin," right? So this idea really became canon in American history at the time. There were dozens and dozens of histories for children and adults that discussed the log cabin being here. Here's just one of many images. This was from a children's book from 1858, I believe. It may have been a little later than that, but it clearly shows Manhattan with log cabins being built upon them, which couldn't be further from the truth. But this idea, it just kept accelerating as time went on, and especially after the Civil War, the log cabin was one of the only things that Americans could agree upon. So there were just a lot more imagery of this. Here's one. This is John Gast's 1872 image called American Progress. You'll see an angel here is leading the white man forward, pushing out the Native Americans, leaving the log cabin and the railroad in their wake. And for the log cabin and the railroad to be equated with one another visually was quite a big deal for a building that had previously been looked down upon as basically a trailer. And another thing that indicates the log cabin's imagery is this image. This is an 1860s postcard. This is actually one of the images I encountered when I first started doing research. And then this image is for Warner's Log Cabin Remedies. The log cabin at this point was so trusted and beloved by Americans that it was used to sell a lot of products, including various liver pills, rose cream, log cabin syrup, which is still available today. It developed in the 1880s. So the log cabin had become this emblem of honesty and all-American goodness, right? Largely because of these false histories. And it's here that I have to take just a quick moment to talk about some of the darker aspects of the log cabin. While Americans were celebrating it as a trusted brand or as a political tool, for a lot of other people, it was just the opposite. The log cabin was used as a prison for millions of enslaved people. Here we have an 1864 image of a collapsing slave cabin, which is probably how it was when people were being, forced to live in there. Elsewhere, the log cabin was used as a tool of assimilation for Native Americans. When they were displaced and they got to their new lands, they were told to build a log cabin. They were not allowed to build their traditional homes. And then also the log cabin was used as headquarters and the epicenter for the early lumber movement, and it led to a lot of irresponsible deforestation, right? So these three things bubbled to the surface through my research, and I realized that the idea that we have of a log cabin really neglects to address these issues, which I think isn't particularly important to mention today as the nation is really grappling how do we deal with our past in a fair way that takes everyone's experiences into account. So while ecological damage was going on, back in more established lands, the log cabin continued to be inspiration for artists. Here we have an 1867 image that again equates the log cabin and the railroad, which at this point I think had already gotten to California and was really indicative of what was happening across America as a whole. Industrialism was ramping up. The world seemed to be changing. The frontier was disappearing. And just like we get anxiety today from a changing world, people back then were even more anxious, right? Because this was just, the machinery that was replacing our agrarian society was really startling. And this is when we start to see people go to log cabins as resorts. They needed to escape the dirty, overcrowded, smelly cities. And ironically, the trend really started with the ultra rich of the East Coast, people who previously, even 40 years earlier, never would have dreamed of staying in a log cabin. They started building massive mansions. Here's one from a New York lawyer named Timothy Woodruff. He built a cabin upstate. This obviously is nothing like what the immigrants were living in back in the early 1700s. It has windows, it had servants' quarters, it was very chic. This was the Vanderbilts' home. It's probably one of the most famous. They called them Adirondack camps. They often describe them as log cabins, but clearly, again, this is not a log cabin. And there's a quote from that era that I think really captures what people thought of log cabin vacations at that time. The writer wrote, "Our forebears utilized log cabins because they had no other choice. We utilize logs because they are our first choice. Pioneering has become an art instead of a duty." I mean, that's really incredible that, over the course of a century, this building that had been denigrated is now considered a chic duty. Anyone who was anyone was going to a log cabin. And all of these trends kept going over the next decades, right? We continued to have the idolization of the log cabin. It was still used as a political tool. It was still in paintings. But meanwhile, back in Wyoming, it was still very much, the cabin was still very much a starter home for people. This image is from 1898. So that again hints at the dichotomy of the cabin in America. While the Vanderbilts were having fancy roast beef in their mansion, people in Wyoming were just getting started. So while it was a vacation destination, the log cabin was still an essential house, which I think speaks a lot about America and the way that we use symbols. And while we're in Wyoming, here's an early image from the Double D Ranch. I believe this is in the 30s, when there was sort of a post-war uptick in vacation homes and interest in going to cabins. And I'm sure this will be discussed a little later, but it was because of the anxiety of the changing times. World War is pretty jarring. But I want to go back very quickly. This is an early 20th century image, again, sort of perpetuating this myth about the log cabin being in Plymouth. And the myth of the log cabin, the love of the log cabin became so great that we see the erection of this. This was a multi-million-dollar neoclassical shrine that was built for a building that was marketed as Lincoln's birth cabin. You see it here inside that memorial, but this was not Lincoln's birth cabin. This was actually just a bunch of random logs that an entrepreneur had found and started marketing as the Lincoln birth cabin. People so desperately wanted to feel connected to Lincoln and his past that they went along with the lie, including the government. Everyone knew this wasn't the cabin, but any sort of protests to the opposite was squashed down in the name of a national myth. And it wasn't until I think 2004 that carbon dating actually finally disproved this myth, and people acknowledged that this was not the Lincoln cabin. So the myth making around this again speaks to how much Americans came to appreciate the log cabin after the 1840 election. After World War I, again, there was an upsurge in log cabin idolization, and that's when we first got Lincoln logs. That's when Amelia Earhart went out to the Double D Ranch. You see her here getting a haircut. I love this picture of her. She was so enamored that she wanted to have a cabin built for herself, but unfortunately she disappeared, so that never came to be. But these trends continued. You know, after World War II, we well, one quote I'd like to read, actually, I'm sorry, from 1934, the same year I believe that this picture of Amelia Earhart was taken. Cabins, getting to a cabin, even building a cabin was seen as sort of an exercise in being healthy. And this quote from Popular Science says, "A cabin can be a real health investment. If you doubt this, try erecting one with your own hands and note how quickly indigestion and nervousness disappear." So next time you have gas, I suggest just going out and building a cabin. And, you know, speaking of gas, post World War II, there was a huge, huge, huge rise in cabin imagery. Here's a log cabin gas station from that era. There were also a lot of frontier cabins. Kids would buy this. This was made of plastic, by the way, but you know, a lot of 50s and 60s era kids might remember this sort of advertisement in the back of Boy's Life or comic books. Certainly the coonskin cap was extremely popular. The 50s were also the era where Disney ran Davy Crockett TV shows and movies, which were hugely popular and actually were the reason why Disney ended up being able to afford finishing the amusement park and becoming the company that it is today. And this sort of idolization and integration of the log cabin continued as you know, the 20th century went on. There were log cabin motels. Here is a 1954 button from Bob Kerr. He was an oil executive in Oklahoma. He was born in a log cabin, and he used that fact. It was the sort of the central pivot of his 1954 gubernatorial race, and he won. This is a pin from that. Then in the next decades, we see hippies starting to use the log cabin to build communes. I love this picture. Life magazine, it was 1969. It was also in this era that a lot of suburbanites started to order prefabricated cabins and you know, build them on plots of land. And again, you know, throughout, it was all these sorts of vacation homes were to feel free, like a cowboy, or as people imagined pilgrims and pioneers to be. It was this idealized vision of what the past had been, and sort of an effort, much like we do today, to recapture it. And you know, speaking of today, after the Great Recession, there was a big interest, and there were, like, you know, log cabin reality shows. The log cabin started popping up in hip hop. There were books such as mine and a book called Cabin Porn, which is also very good. There was the rise of this character, the lumber sexual, who are people who sort of dress like lumberjacks, even if they're in the city. And so, you know, that's kind of amazing to me, is that the cabin, which had once been denigrated and sneered at and was seen as the trailer for people. It had seeped into every corner of American culture, right? Like every sort of group seems to appreciate it. And that is very poetic to me, you know? And that's, you know, that's part of why I wrote this book. You know, you look at the past of the log cabin, we've seen how it spread. It became a cultural symbol, a political symbol, as a marketing tool, black or white. Everyone in America seems to have a connection and an appreciation for the log cabin, and I find that to be very beautiful. And I think that's what makes the log cabin probably the most powerful of American symbols, is how many people have an appreciation in different ways for it. And I think that's why the log cabin could be a symbol that unites everyone in these, you know, very partisan times. I know that sounds a little hokey and, you know, a bit like Pollyanna, but I don't think it's untrue. And just before ceding the floor to questions, I see that I'm running out of time. I want to just highlight this cabin. It's in Maryland. It's known as the Alfred Poffenberger cabin, and it's from 1780. It's obviously survived a long time, including a Civil War battle on its grounds. Yet this cabin and so many other cabins, even cabins dating from the 1640s, continue to stand the test of time. And I think that is a nice metaphor for the United States. You know, we're going through a lot of changes now. We've gone through a lot of changes in the past, and it oftentimes doesn't seem as if we're going to pull through, but you know, we always do, much like a cabin. So, you know, I hope that if anyone ever feels anxious about what's happening right now, you just keep the cabin in your mind and heart, and it'll help guide you through. So on that note, if there are any questions from anyone?
Yeah, we've got several.
Oh,
so
cool.
The first one is, which state has the most historic log cabins still existing, if you know the answer to that?
I believe I do. It's either New Jersey or Pennsylvania, because those are that was like the epicenter when, you know, the Germans went in there too after the Swedes. And I traveled around there a bit and saw some cabins from the 1650s. There's one in Pennsylvania that's actually, it's so strange the way that cities sprang up around these cabins, because you drive under the, like, basically the elevated subway line, and then there's this old log cabin that's the oldest cabin that's still standing in the United States. It's just kind of like off to the side. Really, there's no pomp and circumstance around it. So yes, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, I would say.
And then what is the role, you kind of touched on this, but what is the role of dendrochronology in log cabin research? You kind of touched on that with the Lincoln cabin, how they debunked the cabin, but...
The cabin myth. Well, I have to admit that that is not something I particularly focused on. I mean, I imagine that it's used. So one of the things that I didn't mention is that, you know, these cabins were covered in clapboard a lot. And so sometimes you'll read an article these days of someone who has an old home and they're doing renovations, and they suddenly find a log cabin like tucked off in what they thought was a mud room. And that's because people would cover their cabins with clapboard and then build homes around them. So I know that, you know, carbon dating and that sort of technology is used when people uncover their cabins just to learn more history. But other than that, I can't really speak on that topic, unfortunately.
And kind of going off the clapboard and the historic log cabins still existing, are the really old log cabins that are in existence, are they where you can see the logs, or are they covered in clapboard or something like that?
Good question. They are, you can see the logs. The one I mentioned in Pennsylvania is just like, it looks just like it did. There's a picture of it in my book. I'm sorry I didn't include it here. And then there was another one that I believe is the second oldest log cabin. That's in New Jersey. And it was actually just for sale last year or the year before. I met the owner. He and his wife had lived there for, you know, 50 years. He took me into the oldest part, which had just, you know, a lot of old toys from the 18th century and the 19th century. And it's all cabin all the way around, even on the interior. It, I think, was listed for $1.4 million. Yeah.
And then you mentioned about like shift in the 1800s, early 1900s, where it went from like a symbol of immigrants and poverty kind of to more of a symbol of wealth, and these cabins that, you know, and today I think like in Aspen and a lot of ski resorts, they use like these insanely luxurious cabins. When that shift first occurred, was it political in nature, or was it just like wanting to align yourselves with more the common man, or what was that kind of ideology?
I think it was just, it was a sense, it was not political. It was just a sense of escape. But, you know, the Vanderbilts didn't want to escape to a one-room cabin. They really required a lot. And so that's what went into it, is they wanted to have the illusion of a simple life, but with all the trappings of their wealth. Um, and I didn't encounter any articles, although I'm sure there are some, about what, you know, for example, people in Wyoming or Oklahoma, uh, well, less so Oklahoma, because the plains, they didn't have that many cabins because there weren't any trees, but, you know, what the general populace thought of these cabins. In my book, I do have a few like society articles about the cabins that talk about how chic they are and how there were servant quarters and types of food that they served, but I don't know what the general public thought of it. I don't know if they're particularly aware. They may have been, because this was the era where class consciousness was starting to create a lot of tension in America, pre-unions. So, I mean, that would be very interesting to look at.
So on the frontier and kind of out west, several of the military forts were built in the log cabin style. Did this affect like how the cabin was viewed back east?
No, because it was just, I mean, they were used in Valley Forge, for example, but it wasn't anything that was regarded with any sort of importance. You know, that was like war life. Mm-hmm. So the fact that log cabins were used to house soldiers didn't resonate. It didn't feel, I think, personal in any way. It was sort of like, that's the battlefield. So of course there's going to be this ugly, crude cabin because war is ugly. It was also, I should mention, used to house soldiers in the Civil War by both sides. And the log cabin was, there's some imagery of log cabin field hospitals from that war, which are in the book, but, you know, can be found around the internet as well.
And how important, or wait, sorry, could the movement west of Euro-American settlers have occurred without log cabins, or how would that movement have changed?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that it could have, honestly. And, you know, I'm sorry if I rushed through. That is something that I think the log cabin really, it made America in a way that a lot of people don't acknowledge. I mean, yeah, sure, if there hadn't been forests, you know, pioneers would have figured something else out. They lived in dugouts in the plains, just like the English had back home. But I really don't think that America could be without the log cabin. It was perfect. I mean, there are trees everywhere. You didn't need any money. You didn't need any tools. Once you knew what you were doing, you could build a cabin in a day or two. So it was really, I mean, I know I say that it was being romanticized in the 1840s and such, and that is true, but it wasn't being romanticized for no good reason, I'll say.
And then what are your future research plans? Or do you
that's a good question. Well, I do have another nonfiction book that I have, you know, a stack of research on this big. I'm sort of circling that at the moment because this sort of book is really obviously research intensive, and I'm not quite ready to dive into that yet. I know what it's going to be. It's going to be somewhat similar to this with a much more narrow focus, and it's linguistic in nature is what I'll say. But before I dive into the very lonely work of researching a nonfiction book, I'm working on some fiction right now, actually. So that's been really fun for me because I don't have to look at research, and I'm being able to use some of the themes that I've covered in this book and elsewhere. I'm weaving them into my fiction, so it's actually quite fun.
Will you ever revisit the kind of research that you set out to do originally, like with this book?
Oh my God, yeah, I would love to. Yeah, I think it's a good idea. And if someone out there, I'm not married to that idea. So if someone who's watching is like, this is something I want to pursue, feel free to hit me up and I can send you the imagery I do have if you're willing to, you know, do the work. Because I think that's an idea that should be shared with people. But I personally don't have any plans to do it. At some point, maybe if it's not done in like 15 years, I will.
So you, kind of one of those books that really spread the log cabin to generations now is Little House on the Prairie. Yeah. Did you do any research on that when you wrote your book?
I didn't. I think it comes up very in passing, and only to talk about how the first book was actually called Little House in the Big Woods. Before his Little House on the Prairie, I think the first book she wrote was called Little House in the Big Woods, or they changed the title. But that was the only reference to Laura.
Great. I think that's all of the questions that we have. Cool. So if anybody has any last minute questions, you can get them in like right now.
Easy to find. So if anything occurs to anyone, feel free to, you know, email me or find me.
Yeah, and we also shared the link to Andrew's book. You can order it through Amazon or through a local bookstore. So you have the link for Amazon, and then also through our most local bookstore, which is Legends Bookstore.
Which I think that's a good way to go.
Yeah, and so those are both in the chat box. Thank you so much, Andrew, for being here with us today. This is fascinating.
Who you know, is viewing. Thank you, Amy, for inviting me. Really nice to be here. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks. All right.